Hello friends, welcome to EPG Pathshala. Today we are going to discuss media representation and marginal region. This lecture is a part of your paper Media and Margins. In this lecture, we will introduce the concept of representation in the media and will focus on regional marginals. We will also discuss media representation of a particular region by privileging one over the other, thereby making that region as a dominant one. On a broader note, the lecture aims to enlighten us about how media constructs the regional marginals through being selective in their representation. In this lecture, you will learn about media representation in general terms. We will also discuss about the representation of marginals in media, where the focus will be on regions. This lecture will also provide an understanding of various dimensions of region, and we will also try to find a divide between them, which will serve to locate or identify the dominating and the dominated population as created through media in different regions. So, let us start by understanding what is media representation. Media representation implies the depiction or representation of specific groups, individuals, their experiences, philosophies, or issues through media. Media can involve any form of media, such as the print or the electronic. One thing that needs to be understood is the fact that representation of various or specific groups or individuals does not imply the replication of echoing of reality. As a process, media representation also involves recreation of the new reality and subsequently representing them. As an example of this sort involves children-oriented films which are represented through Western points of view. Artificial truths are constructed through such media reflecting culture of various places which the common population may not have identified otherwise due to a lack of resources or access. As a result of this, such population starts envisioning a world of fantasy which is later reflected in their changing styles of overall living patterns and also the changes in their attitude. The above discussion reveals that media never represents reality. Instead, media becomes selective in their representation of reality. This means that only a part or portion of the reality is represented by the media. For example, any news story, whether disseminating through print or electronic media, goes through a series of phases before being offered to the public, which involves the journalist who collects the information or the raw information, then the sub-editor along with the editor who edits and filters the raw information and then disseminates it to the audiences, thereby filtering stories as per the audience's demands. The final manufactured version of these stories involves the producer's values as well as the audience's values. This sort of media version can be called as media representation. From the marginal point of view, what media depicts cannot be a reality then, because media always engages with editing the stories which they receive from their personnel in the field. News disseminated through any form of media can therefore be called as the constructed story, as said by Stuart Hall, 1995. The central issue in representation through media involves the meanings that media wants to convey to the masses, and these meanings are largely given to the contents through recreation, which further reveals who has a control over media. Before going into what regional marginality means, let us briefly discuss the meaning of marginal. Marginal is a term derived from the idea of margin, which means edge or the end of something, say an object or a phenomenon or even an event or an act. The term also denotes boundary, limits, periphery or extremes of something, etc. The usage of the term margin is always conflicting with the mainstream. From social science and communications point of view, a margin can be an individual or a group located at the bottom of a measuring scale. The scaling is done on the basis of power, access to resources, socio-economic status, and so on. In the process of scaling, those who are positioned at the bottom of the scale can be called as marginals. In terms of regions, the regional margin can be identified as people belonging to certain regions where there is least or no access to resources, where they are powerless and their social economic status is very low. Such groups can be called marginals. Regional marginality is also called as territorial marginality. Therefore, we will use the terms regional and territorial interchangeably. The problems concerning regional marginality can vary among societies. There are various dimensions to the problem of marginality. However, the important ones are the economic and geographical aspects. There can also be cultural, social, historical, and political aspects as the dimensions of this problem. Therefore, marginality cannot be only determined through the peripheral position of a region, but through multiple dimensions. Regional marginality, therefore, entails socio-economic and peripheral aspects of the regions as well as the populations, which invariably mean having the least resources. This makes them marginal. Let us now discuss the stereotyping in representations. Stereotyping as a signifying practice is central to the representation. Hall, 1997. There are many forms of stereotypes based on different identities of the people globally. These identities are based on caste, class, gender, race, religion, and so on. According to Hall, stereotyping forcefully fixes and limits meanings assigned to various groups, which further shapes their perceptions of that group. As a result of this, there is a possibility of the emergence of new identities among such people or groups. On the other hand, we must acknowledge that not everybody agrees with these types of stereotypes, and there is always a scope for contestations. There is a possibility of emergence of new identities and their images through contestations. There is a possibility of emergence of new identities and their images through contestations based on stereotyping. This means that stereotyping involves splitting the society in the sense that those who do not fit according to the standards of the society are excluded from the group. As a result, their exclusion is legitimized due to their stereotyping, and thus they are always deemed as unacceptable to the society. This marks their transition into the category of marginals. This stereotyping further denies them of their right to actively participate in the mainstream, thus ensuring the continuity of exclusion. In India, there are various states and union territories, each having their own distinct identities based on language, topography, culture, living patterns, economy, and so on. All these regions are inconsistently developed. Such a disparity has led to the development of feelings about relative deprivation among the people belonging to the economically unsound regions. On the political front, political parties identified through their region exploit these people's regional sentiments for their political interest. This kind of deception at the hands of regional political parties has bred, in the minds of these people, the demand for separate states. Such awareness among people belonging to these specific regions is created through media by representing conflicting state of affairs between the government and the people from particular regions. If we are discussing regional marginalization in media's representation, we must also take into account the representation of India in the Western media. The process of misrepresentation and stereotypes of Western countries about India has been well discussed in her article by Rani B. Mehta in her article Western Media Stereotypes of the Indian Culture, 2010, has elaborated various issues concerning movies, cultural practices, and public perceptions. She argues that Western media trivializes certain issues in an attempt to remind India of the colonial period as well as a cultural hegemony. Such domination of the Western ideologies is apparently reflected through their concerns over the internal affairs of India. How the Western media portrays or represents India can be examined in terms of socio-economic as well as power relationships between the two, which to a great extent influence the process of creation of media content. Maulana and Wilson, 1990, argue that the flow of information from first world countries to the third world countries is rampant, but the representation of third world countries in the first world countries is too little. According to Shohat and Stam, 1994, the reasons for poor representation of the third world countries in the first world media include an unbalanced flow of information, lack of diversity of information, lack of racial minorities in the Western media houses, etc. Uma Narayan claims that the roots of India's stereotypical representations in the Western media can be traced from the colonial period, where she provides a pictorial analysis of the relationships between the colonial rulers and India, which focused on how the former represented Indians as savage, uncivil, simple folks. According to Ion Devereux, there are four main ways of analyzing representation in the media. The first is about codes and conventions, which means representations can be understood by analyzing the technical and symbolic codes that are used to communicate. The second way involves how discourses about certain issues have developed within the media houses and how those discourses are represented by the media. The third one is framing, which involves framing media content within certain viewpoint as per the editor for representation. It is argued that during the process of framing news, most important part involving vital information is left out during the editing. The fourth and the last is the narrative analysis. This involves analysis of various texts and discussion and framing them during the process of which either of the parties involved in the discussions are often represented as bad guys or good guys, thus increasing the interest of the audiences to know what exactly happened afterwards. This process is generally termed as sensationalization. One common example of sensationalization of news involves narratives about the incapability of certain sections of the people or the government to run the country. The northeastern Indian region have always been underrepresented, misrepresented or stereotyped by the media since independence. According to a report, Media Must Revisit Northeast, published in The Hoot, one of the basic principles of democracy is the integration of different communities, cultures, identities, etc. It becomes more significant in a nation such as ours, where diversity is not merely on basis of cultures and identities, but on geographical differences too. These differences, when not addressed earnestly, turn into violent, which may hinder the process of peace building and also peacekeeping. It also revealed the disdain of the media in initiating such measures. According to Johann Galtung, democracy is a great idea, but it has been badly understood in relation to interstate affairs. If a democracy works well within a country, it will, in principle, produce a relatively content population that, on an average and over time, gets much of its wishes satisfied within the limits of the free will. The northeastern regions of India, according to this report in the Hoot, are getting negligible space and time in the national newspapers and on television channels. Herman and Chomsky, in their joint work Manufacturing Consent, the Political Economy of the Mass Media, which was published in 1988, developed a model called the propaganda model. This model is used to understand and examine the functioning of media. According to the propaganda model, the reasons for a change in attitude of media actors in representation of certain regional minorities can be that money and power are able to filter out the news fit to print, marginalize dissent, and allow the government and the dominant private interest to get their messages across to the public. They further argue that the elite domination of the media and marginalization of dissidents that result from the operation of these filters occur so naturally that the media news people, frequently operating with complete integrity and goodwill, are able to convince themselves that they choose and interpret the news objectively and on the basis of professional news values. The idea of the propaganda model developed in them out of their concern over the flow of information which they believe is affected through various factors such as the size, concentrated ownership, owner wealth, and profit orientation of the dominant mass media firms, as well as advertising as a primary source of income and relying on government, as well as advertising as a primary source of income and relying on government, business, and experts for information. This results in the domination of media by the elites as well as reflects the control of these elites over the regional marginals and therefore decimates their representation through the media. Size and concentrated media ownership as a filter indicates that there are large business establishments, other corporate, elite media houses whose primary aim of disseminating information to the audiences is to either generate economy or to promote establishment. Either to generate economy or to promote their establishment. These agencies do not actually want media to disseminate information unfruitful for them. The second filter is advertisers, who consider media as a primary income generating machine. Private media outlets' main source of income is the advertisements, and therefore they manipulate the news contents as per their necessities. The third is the information sources. Due to the limited reach of media outlets to diverse information created within both governmental and non-governmental besides political domains, they rely on these sources only to supply the information as they want it to be disseminated through the media. The fourth is the criticism that media receives from various agencies, thus pressurizing them through various legal processes like lawsuits and petitions. This pressure is imposed by certain agencies who or whose information is misrepresented or underrepresented through the media. The fifth and the last is the anti-communist approach, which limits the media due to the dominating approach of such parties. The information that is supplied to media has to go through all these filtering processes before they actually reach to the audience. This highly affects the quality and consistency of the information. These filters not only spoil the ethos of media, but also restrict them from providing a space for the contents coming from the regional marginals. This further brings down these regional marginals and they finally lose their faith in both the media as well as the government. Let us now try and summarize what we discussed in this lecture. Media penetration is increasing all over the world. In India, media is becoming more integrated. TV channels, newspapers are increasing day by day. However, there is a lack of ethos within the media and thus what in a sense we call national media withers away. Some of the Delhi-based English channels consider themselves as national media and dominate the media industry. These media houses largely ignore regional issues most of the time. Therefore, the regional languages as well as the issues of people become marginal in this country. However, some of the news channels emerged in certain states, but they do not cover the power centers like Delhi and Mumbai. This indicates that both the regional media as well as the national and mainstream media are at par with each other. The emergence of new and alternative media is attracting the attention, fulfilling the needs of the people having various regional identities. We hope you have enjoyed the lecture. For more details, please refer to the e-text of this lecture, and for further reading suggestions, kindly go through the extended reading list. We also advise you to attempt the questions at the end. Thank you.